Welcome to the 700 Club. 4,000, that's how many rockets Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched at Israel from Gaza. So where did they get the rockets? You guessed it, from the mother of all terrorist nations, Iran. And now the jihadist leaders are bragging about it. So will this incriminating evidence affect the president's nuclear talks with the Islamic regime? Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Secretary of State Blinken he hoped the U.S. will not renew the nuclear deal with Iran, and that if necessary, Israel will chart its own course.
We also reiterated that whatever happens, Israel will always reserve the right to defend itself against a regime committed to our destruction, committed to getting the weapons of mass destruction for that end.
Blinken came with a message to rebuild Gaza.
The United States will work to rally international support around that effort while also making our own significant contributions, including some that I'll announce later today. We'll work with our partners closely with all to ensure that Hamas does not benefit.
For many, it's an open question to see how U.S. and international aid can rebuild Gaza without benefiting Hamas. After the conflict, Hamas's leader gave much of the credit to Iran.
And I cannot but thank those who brought forth money and weaponry to the valiant resistance, the Islamic Republic of Iran, who did not hold back money, weapons, or technical support.
During the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu displayed an Iranian drone intercepted on the Jordanian border.
And that, I think, says everything on the true patron of terror in the Middle East and in the world, Iran.
It's this flagrant support of Hamas and other terror groups in the region that led 44 Republican senators to send a letter to President Biden to suspend its nuclear talks with the Islamic regime. Many, like former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ron Dermer, are concerned sanctions relief would enable Iran to export its terror throughout the region.
Iran is stirring the pot in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza. That's all of Iran's terror proxies in the region, which is another reason, while this is going on in Gaza, we shouldn't lose sight of who the big enemy is, Iran. I hope very much that the U.S. administration will not go back into the dangerous nuclear deal with Iran, and that will continue to keep the pressure on that Iranian regime that represents a threat to us, it represents a threat to our Arab neighbors, and it represents a threat to peace throughout the region.
Chris joins us from Jerusalem for more on the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Chris, is there any question that Hamas is being funded by Iran?
There's really no question about that, Pat. In 2019, there was a deal between senior Hamas officials and Iran that they would up their support for Hamas from $6 million a month to $30 million a month. And, Pat, much of this money is actually sent in cash on its way into Gaza by Qatar. And that's like $360 million a year. And one thing I've heard, Pat, is that if the U.S. or any European governments or any other governments want to help humanitarian needs inside Gaza, is don't send cash. Hamas needs that cash. That's what they've used to build the tunnels, the rockets. But inside Gaza, it's nearly impossible to monitor that cash. It goes right to Hamas's military, and even though Israel right now is reassessing that policy because they're the ones that actually let Qatar go in with those suitcases of cash month by month. And, Pat, it's really important to remember Hamas inside Gaza is a dictatorship. There's a fiction about freedoms inside Gaza. They took over in 2007. There's been no elections since then. And it really bears repeating that its charter says it plans to obliterate Israel, kill Jews all over the world.
Chris, you know, they talk about a two-state solution. There is, in my opinion, it's an impossibility. I mean, given the current status of the Hamas leadership. Am I right?
Well, I think it's a bit of a fiction, Pat. I remember back in 2004, you spoke at the Herzliya conference, and you talked about this cruel chimera, this idea of land for peace. You know, in 2000, Israel gave up land on its northern border, and that allowed Hamas to fill that vacuum and take over. Now there's maybe 150,000 rockets in Gaza, in southern Lebanon. And then they gave up Gaza back in 2005. You remember the disengagement, and look what happened there. There used to be certain, terror attacks, but nothing to the scale right now. And since then, we've had wars in 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, now 2021. So really, this idea of land for peace or a two-state solution is a bit of a fiction. I'd add, Pat, right now, that recently, Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority canceled elections in the West Bank. Why did he do that? Because he knew that Hamas would take over. And if Hamas took over in the West Bank, that would be like Gaza 2.0.
Well, Chris, in this dangerous moment, what is the nightmare scenario for Israel?
Well, the nightmare, Pat, right now for Israel is looking to the north, looking for Hezbollah. The nightmare scenario is a war with Hezbollah. So imagine, Pat, in the last 11 days or during that war, Hamas fired 4,000 rockets in 11 days. But in one day, Hezbollah could fire more than 4,000 rockets in just one day. They have an arsenal of more than 150,000 rockets. The important point, there's not just rockets, they're missiles. And the difference is that missiles are precision guided. They could hit all over Israel. And there is a threat. One expert was telling me just a few minutes ago, it's a threat 10 times bigger than Hamas. And right now, you can imagine Hezbollah and Iran were watching this conflict and learning. And it's important what Prime Minister Netanyahu said earlier today with Secretary Blinken. He said Israel reserves the right to defend itself. So if Israel ever had to attack Iran, that's the trigger for Hezbollah to unleash that arsenal. And Pat, the IDF is saying they will fight back with all their might. They too have been preparing for this war in the north. And so that's the big thing to look forward to coming right now, Pat.
Well, it's a frightening thing, and our prayers are with you. Chris, thanks so much for your insight.